It's okay if you aren't ready for kids right now. It's okay if you don't want to be a mom now or even ever. It's nobody's decision but yours. But do you know what's not okay? Not knowing how effective your birth control is. Talk to your doctor about effective birth control options so you can make an informed decision. Tap to learn more.
Christians are supposed to be a people that are not driven by the fear of death because of who we worship, who we follow, raising the dead. I see a lot of what I'm seeing now in our culture really rooted in the fear of death. For instance, you got Christians think that they can actually save Jesus from whoever the cultural enemies they think Jesus has. Like y'all are more powerful than sin and death. Like that's so liberals, whatever that means. Marxist, socialist, relativist, postmodernist, whoever your cultural enemy of the hour is, apparently they're more powerful than sin and death because Jesus needs to be saved from them. And you're going to become prey to authoritarian regimes promising to save your Jesus from your culturally despised enemies.
Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. My name is Dr. Tom Rundell, and I'm the curator of conversations around here. And today we curated a good one. Today we have a poet, a writer, a faith-rooted community organizer, a good troublemaker, a city council member in Salisbury, North Carolina, a Navy veteran, family man, a theologian, a philosopher, a pastor, a preacher, and a prophet, for sure, Anthony Smith. Now, Anthony is an elected official in his town, and he is up to some good trouble down there. We have some conversation around that. And one of the amazing things about Anthony is that he lives in that liminal space. He used the word apocalyptic. And apocalyptic not as in end of all things, but apocalyptic as in unveiling. And so he has this ability to see behind the veil of what is influencing like the systems and structures of a town and a city and an organization, and then to live in between like what he sees with what is wrong, and then organizing people and aiming them towards a vision that he has in his head of what the kingdom of God looks like in operation here. And he lives in that in-between space between apocalypse and kingdom come. And I don't talk about that in an eschatological end of times, end of all thing, but he does so in the present with a contemplative heart and a contemplative mind. And I absolutely love this conversation. My brain exploded a couple times, and I know you're going to love it too. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Anthony Smith. Well, today on the Liminal Living Podcast, I am excited to talk with a newfound friend, a longtime follower of Anthony Smith. He is a poet, he is a writer, he is a faith-rooted community organizer, good troublemaker, city council member in Salisbury, North Carolina, a Navy veteran, a family man, and may I add, theologian, pastor, preacher, and prophet. Anthony, it is so good to have you on the podcast today. I'm excited. How you doing?
Glad to be here, Todd. Thank you for inviting me, man.
Yeah. Well, I really liked some of the stuff on your Facebook page that described what you're up to, and good troublemaker really caught my eye. So kind of tell us what kind of good trouble you up to these days?
Wow, man, that's a good question. So I'm currently on city council in my city here in Salisbury, North Carolina. I'm actually up for re-election in the fall. So this is my first term. And so one of the things that I've learned about being a local politician or local political leader is that prior to this work, I still am in many ways, a faith-rooted activist. Did a lot, been a part of, still continue to be a part of different justice initiatives in my community. And so I had this sort of preconceived notion that once you enter into the political world on the inside, behind the curtain, that, that stuff kind of fades away. But what I've learned is that that kind of work around stirring up good trouble not only happens when you're in the seat or in the chair, but also there's different levels of government that you have to advocate for your city on behalf going upward. So like, being an advocate for our city at the state and federal level. And so I realized that even, good trouble just doesn't stop in the streets. It also continues in City Hall, and so some of the good trouble, I would say, is making sure we're advocating for people to have a living wage, make sure that we're advocating for affordable housing, making sure that our city institutions, our systems operate with an equity lens. So those are some of the things I've been a part of in the city. So making sure that resources are distributed equitably, that we really try to come alongside and ensure that those in the margins of our community receive what they need to have a stronger neighborhood, to have a well-resourced neighborhood. So those are some of the things I've been doing in the political world. But as a faith-rooted activist, organizer, our community mission house, which is an outreach mission. Now, we were a church, but now we've shifted away from that. We're now a mission. We do a lot of town halls. We do a lot of civic engagement work. We just recently had a town hall where we talked about some of the legislation that's coming down from the state level and how ordinary, everyday citizens can organize and be informed about what they can do to bring about some of the change that's happening. There's a lot of regressive policies in our state being enacted in North Carolina. And so it's been some of the good trouble, man. Other than, I don't know if posting on Facebook is causing good trouble, but apparently it causes some trouble because sometimes there's a lot of people that watch my page. Just found out that there was a local pro-Confederate group that created a page, and they're always posting stuff about me in the community. So whenever I post something, they always post. So apparently Facebook can cause some ripple,
right.
some ripple effect. So
that sounds like it. Now, I saw that you were interviewed, I think it was on CNN, about your work to remove a Confederate statue from like the center of town, and it relocated to a Confederate cemetery, I believe. So were you kind of heading that up, and then that put a target on your back?
Yeah, that was many years in the making. I moved to this city 13 years ago, and this is the smallest city I've ever lived in, to be honest with you. My wife is from here, so I moved here. And so it really began with the Charleston Nine, when the Charleston Nine were killed by Dylan Roof, white supremacist. The next day, there were pro-Confederates perched out by that statue, donning Confederate flags. And I was driving up our main street because this Confederate monument, which is called Fame, the Latin, I think the formal title is Gloria Victis, glory to the victims. And it was a Confederate monument that was put up just over a century ago in the heart of our city. And by the heart of our city is literally off the main street that goes through our downtown. And it's literally the intersection of our county government, major religious institutions, and our media. So it's literally in the heart and the soul of our city. So I remember when I first noticed it, it was just a very beautiful statue. But I remember, as I was learning the city, just the Confederate propaganda, lost cause propaganda that was around it. And lost cause, you know what I mean by that? Lost cause was a narrative. So lost cause narrative was a story that Southerners would tell in the aftermath of the Civil War to try to make the Civil War not about slavery, not about all these other justices and injustices, but it was about the North picking on the South and all this. So it was like a complete retelling, exoneration of things. And so it became a very powerful movement, which led to some of the construction of statues that we now see in the South and other parts of the country, as a way to try to retell the story. So they call it lost cause. And so it was one of those, it was a manifestation of the lost cause movement in the aftermath of the Civil War. So, they make it about states' rights versus federal, states' rights, local control. That's what the Civil War was really about. And that's the lost cause tells us. So anyway, I was driving down the main street, in the street here, and saw those pro-Confederate folks just a day after the shooting. As you recall, that was a very traumatic event for a lot of people across the country, especially for Black people, just to have such a blatant disregard for human life, in particular Black life, in a historically renowned church, Mother Emanuel, which is one of the flagship churches in one of the oldest Black denominations in the United States, church denominations. And so I pull up, and me, I'm a bit of I don't want to say hothead, but when I see injustice like that, my righteous anger turns on. So I told my wife, by the middle of the street, let me out of here. So I get out the truck. And my wife's a little scared. She don't usually hang out with me when I'm doing any kind of action like that or any kind of direct action or civil disobedience. She's like, I'll be on the next block over. I'll keep an eye on you. So, if there's any young activists out here watching this, never jump into a fray by yourself. You know what I mean? But I was by myself. So I jump out there. I saw people cross the street. So I figured I was safe because it's in public view. A lot of people these guys got their Confederate flags out there in the street. So I walked to the guy who was obviously the leader of this group, and I confronted him. And I never forget, he was like, hey, brother, this is heritage, not hate. And I was like curious. I said, they just died yesterday. And the guy, already on the media, they were showing images of Dylan Roof with a Confederate flag draped around his body, wearing it like a cape, right? And I was like, so how is this not hate? I said, this is completely disrespectful. Spiritually, I discerned sometime after that, after reflecting on that moment, because that guy was scared when I walked up to him. I just noticed he was clenching his Confederate flagpole, arms, leg, hands were shaking. And I was like, I said, man, I'm a pastor, man. Not that that matters. I said, I said, I'm a pastor, so I'm not going to, I'm committed to nonviolence, so I'm not going to harm you today. I said, but I just want to let you know that this is not good. This is wrong. This is very disrespectful, and the timing couldn't be worse. After that, that moment made me realize that statue was, part Pentecostal. So Pentecostals talk about a point of contact, right? And what that means is when there's some kind of object that somehow has energy around it that draws certain things. And so it was like, and also drawing off the work of people like Walter Wink, when he talks about principalities and powers. I noticed that statue was a powerful manifestation of the principality and power of white supremacy in our city. So I just, began to work with other people. It was a 5-6 year journey. We began to build coalition out of that. We began to raise some good trouble around it, pointing attention to the history, what it means. And then it began to uncover a lot of things about the city that have not been really addressed. The city, a lot of cities, will talk about diversity, things like this. But it would never get deeper into inequity and injustice and inequality. And so it opened a can of worms as we began to do coalition around that, truth telling around that, going to City Hall, speaking truth. It started to foment sort of a cultural shift. Other institutions started getting involved, church networks started getting involved. And it also exposed certain people in high places of power. People in power starting to post things publicly about how they really felt about things. And it really exposed a lot of people. So it was truly an apocalyptic moment. And a year before it was removed and relocated, a group of us, an ecumenical group of Christians, got together and we had a conversation about systemic racism. Right. And there was something going on in the culture that was pretty blatant. I can't remember what it was, what precipitated this conversation. And we had this idea, like, let's perform an exorcism, right? Like old school. So we got some, this is like Lutherans, Presbyterians, Pentecostals. It was like a hodgepodge of Christians. And we're sitting here, we're having this discussion and prayer and lectio divina around this issue. And we're like, yo, let's go perform an exorcism. Let's go to this statue. So we literally had some holy water. We had some palm branches.
Wow. You had like a whole liturgy set up.
Yeah. So we did a liturgy too. And so we did a liturgy right across the street from where the statue stood. And we did a liturgy together. And I don't even know the actual word for it. I guess exorcist. So me and a retired Lutheran pastor, a white brother, we got together and we walked across the street and we performed the exorcism of white supremacy and racism in our city over that statue. Well, needless to say, a year later, the statue was relocated.
Wow.
It took George Floyd to really push it. And what happened there was, I was a part of that movement. A lot of young people that me and some other more veteran activists had mentored, had organized a lot of the protests of George Floyd in our city. And we were kind of there just sort of coming alongside them, making sure, just giving them wisdom and guidance, and also to kind of stand in the back and to protect. And so on that Sunday, because I think George Floyd was killed that Sunday, we were all out there. And of course, we went to where we know racism is symbolized. We went to that statue. And up until then, there already had been a long, heated debate about relocating the statue, because every time there was a racialized event or a tragic event in our culture, pro-Confederate people, white nationalists would gather, white Christian nationalists would gather at that statue, right? It was the craziest thing. And so we had a counter protest. So during George Floyd, we were out there. We had middle schoolers out there, high schoolers, college kids, young people from the street. Some of the older heads are out there on that first day of action. And a white nationalist drove from another city and fired his weapon near us. He fired a gun. So luckily, he was right behind me, and a friend of mine, he's actually the president of our local NAACP, Jamel Black. We went and surrounded him and brought him over to the police. One, make sure he doesn't fire his weapon again, because he put his weapon in his pants, so he fired it. But anyway, that precipitated the move, because it was almost like it revealed the violence, right? It finally raised its head just enough. Fortunately, nobody was shot, killed, hurt, but it just revealed it. And so I always tell people, when you engage in this work of faith freedom organizing, you're going to, part of the work of, like, Jesus is good at this. You read Mark 5, when he encounters the legion, Jesus has a way to engage that causes the demonic presence to identify itself, to reveal and manifest itself. And so there's different ways that Christians can engage their community to cause for people to see it. And so that racialized violence, that deep primordial racial violence in our community came out. And so then the city leaders had no choice but to relocate it, because it became a public safety issue at that point. It always had been, but they really fully recognized it at that point, because people could have got killed that day.
Yeah.
So that's the short of it. There's a lot of intrigue and all kind of craziness. There were death threats. There were, bricks thrown through people's window. My church was vandalized. Trying to get documents from City Hall that were disappeared. Minutes from certain city council meetings were disappeared. It was the craziest. One day we might have to write a book about it. But anyway, that whole thing precipitated me, George Floyd protests, and the whole thing precipitated me deciding to run for city council, to take it to another level.
You used the term apocalyptic in a very different way than I grew up. I grew up in a white evangelical left behind culture, and apocalypse always tied to everything left behind, everything. That whole eschatology of the Antichrist is about to come. He's probably a Democrat. And It's about to unfold the next thing, Y2K or whatever the next apocalypse is the thing that unfolds everything in these, books that Hannah Lindsay inspired this whole concept and thinking. And you're using the term apocalypse, like in this, like, it's way more biblically rooted, where it's like the unveiling of the powers behind something. Whereas, like, I grew up, everything was individual, you're talking about exorcism, and it's like, well, it's that person, they need an exorcism, or, everything was so individualistic. And you got this mind that can see, like, as you said, the principalities and the powers and you use this apocalypse and even exorcism in like our city kind of a format. And I just absolutely love that picture of unveiling the evils that are present within the city itself that then influence, behavior and outcomes around you in the city. That's just really, is that something that you have always kind of seen, or is that something that you discovered doing your work?
Yeah. It's something that it's from experience, but it was cultivated and sharpened by having interlocutors, like people like Walter Wink, other leaders that I've met down through the years that engaged in this kind of work, and probably on a much larger scale, like the country, national, state level type work. But here's me in a locale, in a city frame, and just seeing, and really the Gospels were the main interlocutor. In particular, the story of Legion is one that looms large. It shapes our engagement, has shaped our engagement, because one thing that we did in our mission work with Mission House, our community, our ministry, we took a year to do Lectio Divina with the Gospel of Mark, like verse by verse, chapter by chapter, slowly. And with the eye of asking a question like, God, what are you up to in the texts? What are you up to in our lives? What are you up to in our city? And when we came to Mark 5, we hovered there for a while, because we realized there was something deep there, some deep wisdom and discernment practice in our community. It led me to begin to read more deeply people like a Walter Wink, for example, who dive more deeper into the principalities and powers and how that whole language works, and other justice and other liberation type theologians that inform that work. But like, even with the story of Legion, the fact that this individual was possessed by a collective, right? And this possession was tied to very real political economy, the oppression of Roman political economy upon his own community. And so his life this person's life was a microcosm of the macrocosm of Roman imperial oppression upon his community. Because when you read the history, study theologians and biblical historians, his community in the 10 city areas, the garrisons, that's in Mark 5, just a generation but prior to Jesus encountering this person, his land, the city was razed to the ground by the Romans. It was burned, oppressed. So this man internalized what the Romans had did to the body politic, did to his community. He was cutting himself, right? He was engaging in self-harm, right? And that's one of the symptoms, one of the byproducts of oppression. People begin to internalize oppression, and they begin to do to themselves what the oppressor had done to them. And so I see that. We saw that together in our corporate discernment around the racial history. Our city was known as Rope City for a long time, early part of the late 19th century, well, from slavery all the way up to the end. But even after slavery, the implementation of Jim Crow, my city had a reputation of being called Rope City because it had several lynchings in the city. And out of that work that we did with the statue, it snowballed into other things. It caused a group of people to get involved in the Equal Justice Initiative out of Montgomery to begin a formal process, to work. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, Equal Justice Initiative. They track, do the history around some of the lynchings that have taken place throughout the South and other parts of the country. There was a movie that was based upon that work, Just Mercy, with Michael Jordan.
Okay.
So it snowballed a whole bunch of different things when you begin to engage in apocalyptic work. Because people always ask me, like, how do Christians do work in the public square? I said, part of the work of the Christians should be apocalyptic, right? How do we engage in the work of unveiling the powers for people to clearly see what's actually shaping, informing the world around us, the political economy, even the way we talk about God around us, right? Even the way we talk about the faith around us and unveiling that. And that's what we see in the prophets, the Hebrew prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah. We see this with John the Revelator in the book of Revelation. He's apocalyptic. I don't know if that's even a word, apocalyptic. He's apocalyptic the Roman Empire.
That's a word now.
Right? He's showing what the Roman Empire really is in reference to, in comparison to what actually happens in heaven, right? And what's happening amongst God's people with Jesus, the risen Christ, amongst them in the midst of this Roman Empire, right? So Christians' work should be to unveil. But unfortunately, it's interesting what you just mentioned about the individualizing tendency. Because we live in Western civilization, which has a tendency to over-individualize things, mm-hmm. It actually blinds Christians to the apocalyptic nature of their faith. So that's why oftentimes in our culture, we see many Christians with a hyper-individualized faith tend to be puppets and co-conspirators with the powers.
Mm-hmm. I see that.
At the national level, state level, even within our cities. And so that's why, because of the individualization of our faith, it doesn't give room for that discernment to go deeper into the apocalyptic nature of the powers and how the powers have really shaped these kind of tendencies that blind us to some of these things.
Yeah, I see that. Like, I have a systemic view of certain things, and then I can critique a system, an educational system or a farming system or a political system. And then the people inside of the system take it personally. Like, why you critiquing me? And I'm not critiquing you. You're stuck in a system. I'm critiquing the system that holds you. And it's really hard to have conversations with people caught up in the systems of things and critique the system they're in, because they're so hyper individualistic and they take it so personally, and they're just like, oh, you mean me? And I said, no, I don't mean you. I mean the overarching thing around you. I'm not talking about you. You're stuck in here. I'm trying to help you. Have you seen that? Or do you encounter that where people take it personally when you're trying to critique the system that's shaping the whole thing?
Yeah, because people are shaped and formed by a larger context. And so we live this is American, right? This is the core of the American project. I appreciate the safeguarding of individual rights. That's a part of our tradition. And I get that in lieu of what America started in protest toward the monarchy of Britain, right? So it was like this whole history there with that. So I get that Enlightenment project around lifting up the individual. But what's happened is that when everything gets centered in the individual, it's hard to see when you're trying to point toward the forest, right? And people just kind of look at the tree, and typically the tree is themselves. And so they can't, sometimes even with some of us who do point out the systemic nature of things, sometimes we do it in a way that does seem to be attacking the individual. And that's one thing that I think Christian, or from the tradition I operate and move with, faith-rooted organizing, is You don't attack individuals, right? You don't go for people. And oftentimes in our culture, whether you're in the left or the right, or wherever you are on that spectrum, we tend to do ad hominem. We tend to go after the individual person, and we don't go after the underlying belief, or we don't go after the history and practices and traditions and rhythms of a system. And a lot of times I have to clarify to people, like, I remember once in our city, some kind of racialized incident happened. The city convened this meeting, and to have a dialogue with the Black community there, this predominant Black community here in the neighborhood here in Salisbury. And the way they did it was said, this is to give space for people to really voice their concerns. And so when they had the meeting, they had these long drawn out presentations of different city officials, different people that they wanted to speak. And they gave like the last 5 minutes for the community to respond, to give their concern. And I remember standing up and saying, this is a farce. This is not, and the mayor at the time, not the current mayor, but the mayor at the time, he took personal offense to that. And he invited me out to dinner. And I remember telling him, I said, man, this train been going way before you jumped on it. That's the best way I can describe to him. Like, you on a train, you just jumped on it for a moment. I said, this train been going. I said, I'm talking to the train, not to you. So, I called him to repentance. But yeah, man, people do it's hard. That's what makes movement building in America very difficult because of the individualism. And we can go deeper, but in particular, neoliberalism, which has given individualism steroids in our culture right now. Because people try to rehash and restyle or to bring back or reincarnate the civil rights movement. And I always tell people there'll never be anything like that. I said, because the culture was different. Individualism, the uber hyper individualism, not culture. There was individualism then, but not at the level that it is now. Now we live in a culture where we have actual elected officials, political systems that are literally attacking public institutions, attacking the work around investing in public goods. In the 60s and 50s, even in the midst of segregation and Jim Crow, there still was a respect for public goods, like public education, public libraries, public pools. So a part of individualism is the privatization of all things public. And so that kind of mindset makes it more of a challenge to organize people to see that the public space, the public goods in our community are a promise to each other to take care of each other as a society. Now, I think we're seeing a turn. Augustine, City of God, when Augustine talks about sin, he says sin is nothing, right? So when you build a whole political economy on sin, it's not self-sustaining. It's going to come to an end. And so when you build a whole political economy around individualism, privatization, the shrinking of public goods, of social safety net, that's not sustainable, because at some point people are going to be naturally excluded and marginalized by that system. And people are going to do one or two things. They're either going to lay down and die, or they're going to rise up and rebel. And so we're in a moment now where policies that were instituted in the late 70s, early 80s in this country, neoliberal policies, they're trailing off now. They're starting coming toward the end. The expiration date's coming. And so now we're beginning to see a tremendous revitalization of collective bargaining, workers, organizing. People at Amazon, Starbucks. It's like, so there's starting to be a sort of awakening that, hey, you know what? In society, it's not just about individuals. God bless Margaret Thatcher. But Margaret Thatcher was wrong when she said societies don't exist, just families and individuals, right? And so they're thinking that the society doesn't exist, just individuals and families. That's what seeped into the culture. But now that's being challenged because it has a shelf life because it doesn't sustain community. So it's crazy when people lament the unraveling of their community, the bonds, the connection, civic participation, right? And people are beginning to realize, you know what, maybe part of the reason is we're too individualistic, right? We don't see how we should bear each other's burdens. We don't see how we should be responsible for each other as a society. And so I'm beginning to see this younger generation begin to crack through that stuff.
You said something on Facebook, I think it was today or maybe it was yesterday, but you said if your preaching of the gospel doesn't inspire your community to transform the material conditions of people's everyday lives, then I doubt the gospel was preached. How has your understanding of this gospel changed over the years to kind of land in that spot?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I became a Christian when I was 20 years old. And prior to becoming a Christian, I was a militant atheist. Part of it because being raised in the South, seeing Christian symbols and language being tied to white supremacy. And then also from a philosophical standpoint, I grew up, and I tell my kids this, and they're amazed when I tell them this. Like, I tell them, I grew up in a Black community prior to crack hitting it. I grew up in a Black community prior to West Coast gangs hitting it in the South, because I was born and raised in Birmingham. So, but I remember the encroaching gang violence. I remember the crack epidemic hitting my community, devastation. I still remember it. I remember what it was like to be, it wasn't utopia, by any means, but I remember the shift. And I just remember as a kid having some theodicy issues with God. Like, if there is a God, why is God allowing this to happen? And plus growing up in a house when I had a parent that had crack addiction and seeing violence, domestic violence, all kind of craziness. So when I turned 20, I was in the Navy at this point. I was in the military and became a part of this church, met this Black pastor who was talked about the African presence in the Bible. And this is kind of new to me. I didn't realize for a long time, I thought Christianity was a kid, I thought it was a British religion, right? Because here's Black people, all Black churches. My grandmother would take me to church every once in a while, and I would go, and here it is. They're reading from the King James version of the Bible, and Jesus, white man, blonde hair, blue eyes. And I didn't understand why Black people would worship a white God with blonde hair, blue eyes, and he spoke in the King's English. And so I thought Christianity was like this British kind of religion. And I was like, man, I don't want to worship British gods, you know what I mean? Because they got a lot of, from Norse gods to pagan gods. They got even Jesus. I lump Jesus all into that. Thor, Odin, like that's, And so I met this Black pastor, man, and he was talking about the African presence of the Bible. And so I got introduced to Christianity in a kind of proto-liberationist context. I got introduced to Christianity in a context that was very conscientious about some of these things. And so although the gospel that was preached was very evangelical in its orientation, penal substitutionary atonement, typical sinner's prayer, that kind of thing, but had this kind of aesthetic of radical proto-liberationist kind of theme around it aesthetically. And so I never understood that gospel. It never made sense to me. Because shortly after joining that church, after coming to Christ, having a profound encounter with the Holy Spirit, shortly after that, I just had a lot of questions. Because my brain, it was like, like John Wesley, my heart was strangely warmed, right?
Yeah.
So I had this profound, mystical, Pentecostal experience with the risen Christ, but my brain had to catch up with my heart. And I still had a lot of questions. And so straightway, here I am in this sort of pro-Black, proto-liberationist, Pentecostal kind of church, learning about my history, my heritage. He's like, hey, man, read this C.S. Lewis, which I cherish Lewis, right? He was very thoughtful, his history and, J.R. Tolkien and all that stuff. And so So within a year or two, man, I was at the Salvation Army store and I picked up this book called Transforming Mission and by David Bosch, really one of the progenitors of what we now call the missional movement in the Western world, right? Bosch and Newbegin really are, I consider, the progenitors of what we now call the missional movement. And what Bosch did was he gives this paradigmatic history of the Christian church, mostly in the West. And he uses Thomas Kuhn's paradigm shift theory with the paradigm shifts within the church. And so he helped historize for me Christian self-understanding of the gospel. And so I did, it made sense. It's like, okay, so Christians have not always understood the gospel the same in different periods in history. And so I was doubly messed up when I realized that the gospel that we were preaching, mostly white evangelical kind of gospel, was fairly recent.
Yeah.
Right. In the history of the church, right? 2,000 years of history.
Yeah.
The way that the gospel is presented is fairly new, right? Maybe 2 centuries at the most. And so if you go back to Jonathan Edwards and all those folks and the Puritans and whatever. But I was just like, okay. So early on, my understanding of gospel was radicalized. It was problematized. And so early on, I came to the realization that the gospel, really Christians should just read the gospels.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like literally just read the gospels and Jesus' message is really clear. The good news is that the kingdom of God is here.
Mm-hmm.
That is the good news. Repent and believe that this is happening. Like the kingdom of God is coming here. It's coming. Yeah. It's coming. So early on, that understanding as a Christian, young Christian, was a part of my thinking early on. So I didn't have a lot of deconstruction to go through. Like a lot of my peers, a lot of my friends had to go through, being situated deeply in sort of very conservative evangelical kind of culture, or even Protestant liberal culture, or whatever culture you're part of, that tends to over individualize, and kneel to empire and gospel. And so, so early on, man, I understood the gospel. It was about the coming of the kingdom of God. Now, what that looked like, that changed, right? Because I'm still myself in a context of individualism. We're still living in this culture. I had to come to the realization, the kingdom of God, Jesus was calling for a whole new social order that was energized and graced by God. Like this is God's intention for human civilization. And Jesus was calling a community to demonstrate that in the midst of the current arrangement, right? So that's kind of been, there was a kernel of that early on, and it's just kind of grown and continues to grow. And I continue to interrogate what my meaning of the gospel is. And I think that's part of the responsibility of every Christian, is to always interrogate your understanding of what the gospel even means. Like for me, that's a part of faithful discipleship, right? To always interrogate that.
Like the kingdom of God is coming. How it comes today is going to be different than how it needed to come yesterday and the day before. You might need a totally new perspective today because things change fast. So I like that. I like that, a process of discipleship, re-asking that question. That's good.
Right. Because God, man, you're dealing with an eternal God and continually changing context. But the problem is Christians tend to make our words and beliefs about God eternal. The language that we use. Yeah. We make our language eternal when God is much more than a language we use.
Right. Yeah. And that's one thing, like, we're not ready to change something we were doing wrong until it's like 100 years later, like if you noted, like the Catholic Church didn't forgive Galileo until like 1996. It's like,
I know.
It's like when you read about stuff like, it makes me have more of a humble grasp of what we're dogmatically, weaponizing today, and saying, in 100 years, what do we say about this? And right. It humbles me because, I know how we've changed from the last 100 years and what we stood against, what we fought against and we were wrong about, even just 50 years ago. And it's like, it's a very humbling experience to study history, your history particularly, and say, what do I think, I'm hanging on to today that I'll have had to change my mind in 5 years, it just gives you a looser grasp on that stuff.
Yeah. And that stuff becomes, a lot of that is rooted in the fear of death. Christians are supposed to be a people who understand that perfect love casts out fear, right? Mm-hmm. We're supposed to be a people that are not driven by the fear of death because of who we worship, who we follow, raising the dead, right? Mm-hmm. So I see a lot of what I'm seeing now in our culture really rooted in the fear of death. For instance, you got Christians think they can actually save Jesus from whoever the cultural enemies they think Jesus has. Mm-hmm. I always thought it was a curious project. I never understood that early on, why Christians feel like they had to save Jesus. Like, so like y'all more powerful than sin and death. Like that's
serious.
So liberals, whatever that means, Marxist, socialist, relativist, postmodernist, whoever your cultural enemy of the hour is, woke people, whatever, apparently they're more powerful than sin and death because Jesus needs to be saved from them.
Man, that is a powerful phrase because, how we're acting is absolutely out of fear.
Any human being that says they can save Jesus for us or Christianity for us is an idol. Mm-hmm. And you literally had political leaders that were saying that to a whole cultural swath of Christians in America that followed that. They really believed that. And so I had to ask, like, how do you worship? You know what I'm saying? Like, how do you read the Bible? How do you pray? Because Jesus is raising the dead. Either you believe or you don't. Mm-hmm. And so I believe that Jesus is raising the dead, not just as a matter of mental assent, right? Because if it's just mental assent for you, then you're going to become prey to authoritarian regimes promising to save your Jesus from your culturally despised enemies. And so...
You just blew my mind up with that phrase. That was a good one. That was such a good one.
Yeah. Think about it, man.
I am right now. Like,
it's the kind of, no disrespect to my atheist brothers and sisters, but it's a kind of atheism, really. It's a really disenchanted view of the world, man. It's very cynical.
Holy cow. I've never looked at it that way before.
Yeah, I mean.
As a form of atheism. And it's like this white Christian nationalism is actually just a form of atheism.
It is.
At its heart, I've never seen that.
And it's like bad atheism. It ain't like good atheism.
Yeah.
Because I have atheist friends who I love dearly and I care about.
Yeah, same here.
Like good atheists, and it's genuine. But I'm talking about a very cynical, we gotta grab power. It reminds me of Judas. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? And this will help us, I think, have compassion for those who are disenchanted and cynical, maybe white Christian nationalists. It reminds me of Judas, because Judas typically gets a bad rap. But I understand Judas, right? Because he saw Jesus. He started to see Jesus doing things like, man, he knows Jesus got the power, right? He knows Jesus has the power, and he's walking on water. He's controlling, weather patterns, and feeding thousands of people, and doing all these crazy signs and wonders. And he's like, he's the man. He's the one. He's like, you know what I'm saying? He's like Neo, you know what I'm saying? And then Judas is like, then Jesus starts saying stuff like, oh, okay, well, they're going to kill me. Right? Yeah. They're going to, this is what has to happen. This is what's going to happen. And I can see Judas like, no, that's not my version of what Jesus should be he should be a kick-ass, right? He should be, it should be like the Roman emperor plus.
Right.
So what if I betrayed him and I forced a battalion of Roman soldiers to show up, right, for him to kick ass, to show him his power? But then what happens?
Yeah.
He gets arrested and gets killed. And what does Judas do? He kills himself, right?
Yeah.
Because he realized he knew he was the one, but he got the one who he thought was the one killed. I kind of see some of my white Christian nationalist brothers and sisters in that vein. Like, this is what you think Jesus is about. You think Jesus really is, you think America is Jesus' nation. You think in all the things that America has done because America is not a Christian nation, is a political economy that was created by humans, frail, broken humans. We can go deeper, but it was rooted in all kind of injustices, right? And it has beauty to it in trying to create space for individual rights and trying to get away from the monarchy and all this kind of stuff. So there's beauty and grace in the American project, but when you identify all of this with Jesus, you feel like that project survival is synonymous with the survival of Jesus. So the nation state project becomes synonymous with the survival of Jesus. And so people literally are thinking that, like I saw somebody today, what happened to the public school? They took God out of the school. So I'm like, that's so atheistic. That's like, how can you take God out of anything?
Yeah.
Right? Like, God is a thing that can be manipulated, an object. But this is what happens when Christianity becomes ideology for the nation state. And so that's a lot of work, man. Like, we got some serious questions around the discipleship, how we worship, how we understand the gospel, God, all that good stuff. And and I'm always under interrogation. I'm always deconstructing things and asking myself questions. And but you got to connect that with a contemplative life.
Yeah.
And the living God. Repentance, confession, these kind of ancient practices that keep us sort of alert, hopefully sensitive.
Now, you wrote something, I think it was last week on Facebook, that really caught my attention. I loved it. You said, I refuse to be responsible for other people's projections, insecurities, and baggage when I decide to fully show up with my passion, intellect, and love. I used to shrink from my own self when encountering such people, but after my heart surgery, I more than realized that time is short and shrinking back can be detrimental to the mission. We got stuff to do. Ain't nobody got time for that today. How did you... I chuckled when I read that one, and then I hit the like button, and it was good. And how you mentioned, you had a heart surgery that then it's kind of almost like waking you up to the preciousness of who you are.
Right.
What can you kind of walk us through how this came to be, how this thought kind of bloomed and flowered?
There's a lot there.
There is.
So one of the things I learned, when you decide to be a public witness for good news, for justice, in a courageous way, there's instant target, right? You become identified. And so, and this happens with pastors, pastors, we get a lot of people, they project upon us, right? They project their own traumas, their own wounds, their own things. And then sometimes pastors do mess up and they deserve to be all out for whatever. But what I learned as a pastor and as an activist is that people will literally put on you things that have nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
your story, your journey, your wrestlings. Not saying that we're perfect, but so when I got COVID, and COVID actually precipitated blockages, severe blockages in my heart. And I could have had my, when they went to do the heart catheterization, they found out that I had 3 major vessels that were almost 100% blockage. And so I could have literally had what they call a widowmaker.
Yeah.
Which is you just fall over and go like that.
Wow.
Yeah. So luckily I just happened to go to this heart catheterization because I was having some shortness of breath issues. And because I had a heart attack just months prior to that. And so because of COVID. And so they were like, yo, we got to do open heart surgery. So I went to heart cath, went immediately prepped for a couple of days for my heart surgery. I had triple bypass and went in for triple bypass. They only could do 2. One bypass was kind of hard for them to get to. One vessel was hard for them to get to. But I just remember going in scared to death. Like, man, I possibly won't wake up after this. Like, this could be it. And I just went to a moment of deep reflection. Like, I had a couple of days because I didn't, some people get time to prepare for these kind of things. I only really had a couple of days to prepare for this major heart surgery that I didn't anticipate. I went in to my heart cath, the doctor saying, we may have to increase your medicine. We may have to put a stent in, maybe. We don't know. I didn't think I was going to be told, oh, we got to do a triple bypass.
Yeah, geez. I mean.
Yeah, so that was like, oh my God. And so when you're faced with something like that, I'm not sure if you ever came into an existential crisis like that, but it's like, it caused you to really think about your life. And it was like, man, what am I doing here? What is this? And when I went into surgery, I went down not knowing when I was going to wake up. When I woke up, and I saw my son, I saw my wife, and I remember going through recovery. And I remember when they rolled me out in that wheelchair to get back in my car, put me in the car, I was like, man, I can't. I have to live the life that's been gifted to me, right? I can't sing another person's song. I can't live another person's story, right? And so I have to live the life that I've been given. I have to tell the story that I need to tell. And so I just came to the realization that that I have things that I have to do in this world before I leave here. And the reality is, for whatever reason, if certain people don't understand it or they disagree with it, and that's fine too. But when people try to attack you or try to say things to try to throw you off, then I realize, they're not fully aware of their own story yet.
Yeah.
There's something going on with them. They have some kind of blockage going on with them that it has nothing to do with me. And so for me, it was a deep realization that, I have to own the things I can own, but there's certain things I refuse to own. And I had to learn how to be diplomatic with it, because now it's like people, when I first kind of came to this realization, people would say things. I'm like, what happened to you? Like they were coming to me with something and I'm like, what happened to you? And they're like, what do you mean what happened to me? I'm talking about you. I'm like, no, you're not talking about me, actually. You're talking about you.
Oh, man.
This is what's going on. What happened to you?
What kind of response do you get to that?
Well, most people, man, it caused them to, some people are like, depending on how they're angry with me about something. But most people, they're like, it throws them off. They don't expect an answer. They expect me to go tit for tat with them about whatever it is that we're talking about. And I'm like, I'm not going to engage in a reason debate with someone that's bleeding all over the place emotionally, right?
Yeah.
I think it's Richard Rohr who talks about whatever's not transformed is transmitted.
Yeah.
Right. And so I see that a lot with folk, man. I see it with myself sometimes, even still. You know, we usually transmitting stuff that's not been really dealt with and transformed, the places that we've not done the work. And so, man, it's crazy how suffering, I think it's Rumi who said this, about cracked jars bring in light. You know, light is able to penetrate with broken jars because the light can crack. It can go through the cracks, right?
Yeah.
And it's something about suffering that allows more light in. I don't know what it is about that. There's probably some deeper luminescent minds that can break that down for us. Kevin Sweeney, the mystic.
Yeah. We talked about some of that stuff a little bit.
Yeah. Suffering can crack us to bring more light in. And there's also this thing, man, where, you know, man, like I came to the realization, like, you know, man, I didn't ask to be here. Like nobody on this earth, I'm assuming, I don't know, but I just assume that none of us asked to be here. Like nobody asked me if I wanted to be here. Nobody asked me, Anthony, you were born February 1st, 1973 in Birmingham, Alabama. Nobody asked me that. We're just here. And so when you awaken to yourself, when you become self-aware, you begin to realize your power, you begin to realize your gifts and your graces, you begin to realize how holy you are a gift in this world to bless others, to love others, to bring your light into the world. And so when other people are wounded and they project and are traumatized or whatever is going on, and your light bothers them, then I don't get mad at people when they get mad at my light. I mourn for them. I lament, but I'm going to keep shining.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? Because I didn't ask to be here. This light in me didn't ask to be here. It was sent here. I was, you know, we're all sent here as light, to be light in this world, light and love.
Yeah. That whole I didn't ask to be here, like that, like turned on a light over here that says, if we didn't ask to be here and we're a gift to be, it's a gift that we are here, then we need to stop asking for permission to exist here and just live the lives that we have.
Right.
But we live so much of our lives is like apologetic. Like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm such a, burden to everybody around me. It's like, wow, that's just a different perspective.
Yeah, it's this thing like we're not worthy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I never understood that. I mean, I know it seeps in the Christian language.
Yeah, it does.
But I don't see that. I don't even see that in the biblical witness.
Mm-hmm.
Right. What I see is when it's clear, like when we say, like when the prophet said, our righteousness is like filthy rags, right? Mm-hmm. The prophet wasn't saying that we are filthy rags, but it's our attempt in the particular context of that verse to try to act righteously. We think we're doing something, right? When God is saying, man, you far from it. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. What about the poor? What about the widow? What about the orphan? Right? What about the stranger? Are you doing justice for them? Because if you're not, then your righteousness sucks. Right? So there's this thing in a lot of Western, I think it has to do with the West too. Western, there's like this, Krister Stendahl wrote about the introspective consciousness of the West. You heard of Krister Stendahl?
I have not, but now I want to.
Oh yeah, Krister Stendahl, man. Dude, he wrote this book think it's back in the 70s, 80s. It's called The Introspective Consciousness of the West. And it's about the conversion of Paul. And you're saying how Paul's conversion really wasn't a conversion, right? Paul didn't have this sense of unworthiness before. He literally was about his business of destroying this early nascent Christian movement because it was getting in the way of his understanding of Judaism, right? And so he's like, Paul had a very robust personality, a very robust ego, and it doesn't dissipate even after he comes to Christ, right? And so this sense of worthlessness, I'm a worm, even the way Christians talk about, realizing that you are a sinner, right? You ain't worth it, but God, killed Jesus instead of you, right? So, I mean, that's just put it in plain language, right?
Yep.
So it's like, because you're worthless, and God would just prize himself and, allow his son, he would kill his son instead of killing you, judge his son instead of judging you, pour his wrath on his son instead of pouring his wrath on you, because even then it would have been worth it. You wouldn't even worth having this wrath poured on. And so it's an interesting turn, and I'm sure people have written a lot about this, why there's such an introspective consciousness in the West around self-loathing and self-hatred. But I don't think that's healthy. I don't think it's Christian, actually.
Yeah.
I just think that's a very Western kind of looking at the human person that's seeping into Christian language and culture. So when Paul says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, he wasn't saying for all who are engaging self-loathing and self-hatred.
Right.
He's making a clear evidentiary statement. Humans are sinners, right? Humans do sin, right? But it doesn't mean that we're not worth love. It doesn't mean that we're not worth prizing and adoring, Anyway, that's another thing,
I like what Hillary McBride, she's a counselor that does a lot of religious trauma work. She says if somebody gives you a critic in your head and then tells you that person is God, then that's religious trauma. And it's like, wow, man, yeah. Like that. But that's easy to control, and I think some of the, Western colonial aspect of Christianity that has worked itself into Christianity is about organizing, controlling, groups of people. And it's just easier to control someone when they think they're, a piece of trash and they need you, to tell them that they're going to be okay. It's just easier to control the groups of people. So it might be just a byproduct of that. I'm not sure. That's just a suspicion I got.
Right. Wow, that's good, man.
I think we should, I could keep talking all day. This has been such a good conversation. I've loved it. But what's coming to mind in the last podcast, I read this long section from Howard Thurman when he talks about the sound of the genuine. You got to listen for the sound of the genuine in you. And this is like what I'm hearing in your work, in your life, what you're up to, the good trouble that you're causing, that whole, pastor, prophet, preacher work that you are up to. It's all coming out like this piece of authentic, genuine music that's coming out. And that story of your heart surgery, it looks like you finally like that was a pivotal moment where you're like, I know my song and I have to sing it. And I got one more quote here from you. You said, seek purpose by following the small clues and breadcrumbs in your life. Your purpose is not in some faraway zip code away from you. It's been in you this whole time. Seeking purpose is looking for the signs of uniqueness before purpose begins to blossom. To seek purpose is to learn the ancient art of paying attention to our lives. And I love that quote. Do you want to add anything to that or talk about that in closing?
Yeah. people ask me, like, what's the skill that people need to learn, man? Right? Aside from being curious, we kill our curiosity as we get older. We stop being curious. I think curiosity is probably one of the most powerful practices and things that we can do as human beings, is be curious about the world. But the thing about curiosity is, curiosity happens with people who are paying attention, right? Children are very curious because they pay attention. They don't miss anything.
That's true.
Right? They pay attention to a lot of things that we don't even pay attention to. And so I've had to relearn, there's a term I think our Buddhist brothers and sisters use. I think it's second naivete. Having sort of a naivete about our lives. Kind of reminds me of when Marcus Borg wrote his series. I think it's reading the Bible again for the first time or something like that. And so we need to look at our lives that way, right? We need to look at our lives again as if it's the first time. There's got to be seasons when you have to imagine your life being like a scene, and you're a detective and you're trying to watch the clues and pay attention to the clues of your life. And so, and we don't do that. And a lot of times it's hard to pay attention in this culture, man. There's so many things that distract us.
Yeah.
For many different things, distract us from a lot of things. But one thing is distracting us from the genuine that's in us, because so much conformity happens. People not only not paying attention to ourselves, but like even our children or young people around us, babies, like certain uniquenesses that our children around us have. I remember when I was raising my kids are grown now, but when they were little, like infants and toddlers, and, just had this sense that, I really need to pay attention to them. Like, what's their bent? What do they gravitate towards? And we don't do that with ourselves. And sometimes people find it. Sometimes people find it later in life. But I find that part of the challenges I think people are experiencing in our culture, it could be, and I don't think that a lot of our systems around us support this. That's why I think there's such a deep wisdom with cultures that are more deeply rooted in nature that we can learn from our indigenous brothers and sisters. And they build whole ecosystems, human collectives around these kind of rhythms of paying attention. I think we can learn from. But we literally have built entire political economies around distraction to keep us from paying attention.
Yeah.
And we wonder why a lot of people can't see the climate disaster that we're causing. We're literally destroying our own habitat because we're not paying attention.
Yeah.
So yeah, man. So not just a level of individual purpose and authenticity, but even as a collective purpose and authenticity, global, planetary.
Yeah.
Let's learn how to pay attention.
Yeah.
There's some powerful stuff in that,
Yeah, absolutely is. It is. Well, I would like to close with one more quote from you in your awesome Facebook page. And we'll just call this our benediction for today.
That's funny. Awesome Facebook page.
Yeah, it was good. You said, if I show up with bells on and a fire for the mission, don't get weird on me. Strap on your bells and get on fire for something to make a difference in somebody's life. And I feel like a fire kindled in me from our conversation, and I hope our listeners will have that too. So thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your perspective and just being faithful where you are.
I appreciate that, man. Thank you for inviting me again, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, we'll have you on again. This has been, my brain blew up a couple of times, so. All right, I still don't know how to end podcasts, so I just hit stop. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Liminal Living Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this conversation today with Anthony. I hope you're inspired to pursue the sound of the genuine in you and to show up with bells on and a fire in your heart and get some good stuff done and go make some good trouble. I'm going to go do that myself. I'm going to go make some good trouble around here in my city of Langsburg and at home and around the places. So we will see you next week. We got another conversation lined up. We got some really good ones coming up here in the month of September and October. And I promise I have not forgotten about some other questions for some Ask Me Anything episodes. Those are also in the works. So be on the lookout for those as well. So we'll see you next week where we have some good stuff planned, more conversations, more ideas, more perspectives for y'all. And thanks for joining us. Peace out.
It's okay if you aren't ready for kids right now. It's okay if you don't want to be a mom now or even ever. It's nobody's decision but yours. But do you know what's not okay? Not knowing how effective your birth control is. Talk to your doctor about effective birth control options so you can make an informed decision. Tap to learn more.